have a contribution really, I think, in this. In 2005 we developed the eye-level reading ruler, which is an expensive little thing. Quite a few of you probably know about it already and maybe use them with some of your students. But they're cheap and they're easy to use. Kids like them, and they're in about 60% of the schools in the country now in the UK. So we've got a little bit of a place in the history of visual stress awareness just by making those interventions readily available. Terms for visual stress. I've mentioned Erlen syndrome. It was Helen Erlen that actually came up with scotopic sensitivity. There's a term visual dyslexia that's used sometimes. There's Erlen syndrome, which is a registered trademark, sometimes known as Mears-Erlen syndrome, recognizing Helen Erlen and Olive Mears as the originators. Misfits, which if you look at it carefully is a combination of Mears-Erlen syndrome and visual stress. Now the problem with all those different names is if we don't know what to call it, we can't agree on what to call it, how are we going to agree on how to deal with it? So I like to use the word visual stress. It's the preferred term of the visual scientists, certainly in the UK, and it's what I will be referring to in this presentation. So visual stress it is. The symptoms, these are rather crude attempts at rendering some of the manifestations of the condition. Movement of letters and words wobbling or flying off the page. I remember a teacher I was talking to, she was in her 40s, who just discovered she needed overlays, and she talked about her experience as a student in school, in exams, and she said the words literally used to fly off the exam papers and used to try and catch them with her hands. It wasn't for another about 20 years until she discovered that there was quite a simple solution. So words or letters flying off the page, the apparent size and spacing of letters seeming to change. Letters seeming to fade or blur. Excuse me while I drink some water. A condition called pattern glare. Some people call it worms or rivers or waterfalls. It's actually the white background standing out more prominently than the black text or representations on the page. Pattern glare. There's actually a pattern glare test developed by Bruce Evans, who's an eminent optometrist, which is a good indicator of visual stress. Skipping lines, reading lines in the wrong order, which is why that one popped up there. Colours or blobs, some people call them rainbows, appearing like that on the page or around words. Various distortions and difficulties that mean text is difficult and in some cases practically impossible to access for somebody who has got visual stress. Some of the research behind it. Text, which is what we're primarily dealing with in this consideration, is difficulties with reading and accessing text. Text is basically a pattern of stripes. Wilkins did a lot of his research, his early research, particularly with epilepsy, and there are quite a few connections, neurological connections between epilepsy and some of the aspects of the neurological aspects of visual stress. But the patterns of stripes are actually strong stimuli, which can, with certain frequencies, can in fact cause difficulties. They are or can be epileptogenic, say it properly. And I'll show you some different types of text with different stripes. Some research has been done, again by Wilkins and other colleagues in Germany, looking into the effects of fonts on reading and seeing what could be discovered by comparing different types of words. If you think of the stripes in words as almost like speed bumps, for many people, most of us obviously, as you read and your visual perception travels over a word, there isn't any difficulty and you process everything that you're looking at. But for some people, the stripes in the words are sort of like speed bumps and they slow down the reading process. The stripier the word, the more difficult it is to read. Now, if you want to make a note of that, if you want to follow that research up, Jainter, Jasinski and Wilkins came across the effect of periodic metastrokes within a word affecting fixation disparity during reading. In other words, basically the speed of the reading process. And if you look at Baum, it was done in Germany, there's German words, tree and game. If you look at the stripes in Baum and the stripes in Spiel, there are more speed bumps in Baum, and the research found that words like that were essentially more difficult to read for some people. It's because of that, this is a bit of an aside, but when you're printing your own material, producing your own material for children to read, that is why you want to choose the rounded fonts. Times New Roman was a popular one for a time, not a good font at all. Far too many stripes. That Baum and Spiel are actually in Times New Roman. Fonts like Comic Sans, that's why Comic Sans is good, because it's not a stripy font. Therefore, easy to process for some people. Verdana is another one. So look for the rounded fonts. I'm hearing somebody there. Okay, it's moving on. Theories behind. Now these are still theories. There's basically two ways that visual stress is looked at by scientists. One group of research in Oxford and one in London. This is the Oxford theory, which is put forward by Professor John Stein. Everyone agrees it's visual perceptual in nature, most probably originating in the visual cortex. Now, this is called the magnocellular theory. A deficiency in one of the visual pathways, possibly also as a result of certain nerve cells firing too rapidly during hyperexcitation. Those are the two theories. Okay, this is introducing the two theories. So one theory thinks it may be because of a deficiency in a visual pathway. Another theory thinks it may be because of certain nerve cells firing too rapidly due to hyperexcitation of those cells. We'll look at that in a bit more detail in just a moment. Let's look at the first one. This is the magnocellular theory. In a sense, you could call the magnus cells and parvo cells the fast lane and the slow lane in the brain. I am reading what's here. I don't like being a PowerPoint monkey in that sense, but I think it's probably quite good in this particular context to read what's on the text. That one of the functions of the fast pathway is to inhibit the slow pathway when the eyes are moved, so that the image of what was previously looked at doesn't persist. I think you can probably see where this is going. And some scientists, particularly Stein and his colleagues in Oxford, they believe that in cases of visual stress, it's because the fast pathway may be disabled to varying degrees, which then allows an after image to remain and interfere with perception. And this is what blurs the letters and causes them to move or jump around. Essentially, your eyes move on, your visual cortex is starting to process the next bit, but there's an after image remaining which gets in the way. I've got a little picture of what may be happening there. By the way, I've got some coloured backgrounds coming in now. Some of you might find that suddenly is a little bit easier on the eye. This is the magnocellular deficit theory, as I said. And if you think of one as the fast lane, there's your fast lane, there's all the cones. These aren't retinal cones, these are cones on the road. There's your roadblock, there's the problem. The fast lane isn't working so well, and because it's not working so well, the parvo cells have got too much to do. You travel on the M6, you know what that looks like, or the M25. That essentially is magnocellular deficit. One of the, in a sense, lanes holding up the traffic, causing the other one to have too much to do. Therefore, you get the disturbance and the distortion. Moving on to the other theory, which is cortical hyperexcitability. This is Wilkins's findings, Arnold Wilkins of Essex University. He would say that it's because some cells in the visual cortex are firing too rapidly in response to certain wavelengths of light, and that is what causes the distortions and the discomfort. So cells dancing around. Now, it's important, it's in response to specific wavelengths. And the response is different in different people. Aaron, there's some rattling around in the background there. I don't know. Was that you, Katrina? There's a mic. Someone's got a mic on that shouldn't be on. That's better. Okay. So, a bit more on cortical hyperexcitability.
Sorry, Bob, that was my fault. I clicked the wrong button.
Oh, dear me, Aaron. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So individuals who see more distortions in stripe patterns, as Hollis and Allen, are those who read more quickly with their chosen coloured filter. The principle being that a specific coloured filter calms down the activity in specific cells of the visual cortex. People who are susceptible to distortions can be identified objectively by the decrease in the speed of visual search that occurs when the search task is surrounded by an aversive pattern of stripes. In other words, if you give somebody with visual stress a visual job to do that involves a lot of stripes on the page, they find it more difficult to carry out that task. This is actually the research that's behind Lucid's VIS software, visual stress assessment software. It was carried out at Hull University, the Department of Psychology, where Singleton was head of department. The point of this is that precision tints rearrange cortical activity in such a way as to avoid strong excitation in the hyperexcitable orientation columns. In other words, you put the right filter on the right wavelength of light, and the specific area of the visual cortex that is being overactive in response to that wavelength is no longer overactive. Or in other words, the avoidance of strong excitation in hyperexcitable columns may prevent the spread of excitation, and with it, the inappropriate firing of visual neurons that gives rise to, and a bit of my text has disappeared, distortions is what it should say there, distortions. Okay, distortions, discomfort, words moving around, these are all caused by essentially certain neurons in a certain bit of the visual cortex doing too much. Interference, in other words. There you go, illusions and distortions. Vision and reading difficulties. Again, we sell that, but you probably get it cheaper from Amazon. It's quite a scientific book, that, but it's quite a small book and quite an expensive book. But if you want to get into the thinking about different aspects of reading difficulties and their relationship with vision, not just visual stress, but things like binocular instability, the whole relationship between vision and reading difficulties. It's an interesting and useful little book. It's quite dense, quite small, quite expensive, but there's a lot of good information in there. And this picture, I think, sums it all up. These are brain scans taken at Irvine University in California. There's somebody with diagnosed visual stress reading without a filter, and a filter then was put over the text that they were reading. I think it was a blue one. And there is the brain scan of the same person at the same time reading through the blue filter. And you can see the difference in the activity taking place in those areas of the brain. Cortical hyperexcitability. Now, this is on the slide or not. No, it's not. But just to say that the two schools of thought have a different approach to what filters to use. Some of you may have come across the Stein research, some of you may have crossed the Wilkins research, some of you may know both of them. And if you do, you will be aware that Stein says that the colors to use to stop these distortions taking place and to bring visual stress relief are blue and yellow. Wilkins says that you need a range of colors evenly spaced around the spectrum in order to deal with all individuals who may have hyperexcitable columns. And also those colours need to be evenly spaced so that you can double them up as well and end up with a range of about 30 colours to choose from if you combine them. That's the Wilkins. So Wilkins and Stein have got different ideas. Now I've got my own thoughts on that. It's not research based, it's just some conclusions I've come to. But I think they're borne out by some figures. But before we come to that, who does experience this? Well, 5% are severely affected. 20% are mildly affected. That's a lot of people. It's 10 children in every average sized primary school. Only 5%, an average sized primary school being 200 students, are struggling to read because of visual stress. Now the thing is, if the colours are dancing around, jumping about, fading in and out, it doesn't matter what phonics program you put them on. It doesn't matter how much attention you give them. It doesn't matter what you do, unless you can do something about what's happening in their brains and in their visual cortex to enable them to process the letters and start to blend them. I don't think it's on this slide or any of these slides, but there was a little 6-year-old boy, so he was year 2, and he was being assessed with the visual stress assessment pack that we do. And the assessor had, he was going through all the colours and wasn't getting any response. And this child couldn't really decode a CVC word. He effectively wasn't off the starting blocks, and he was in year 2, so you can imagine where that was going to go. And the assessor got to blue, and then he doubled up the blue overlay. So it's quite a deep blue that this little boy was looking at. And apparently he sat back in his chair and blinked, and he said, "Is that what you mean by a word? Can I start learning to read now? If you don't take away anything from this talk except that quotation, please take that with you. Is that what you mean by a word? Can I start learning to read now?" This was somebody who saw text through colour for the first time. And he did start learning to read. 1 in 10, 5%, 10 children in every average primary school are struggling. Maybe not quite as badly as that, but are 2 years behind in their reading quite easily. So the ones to look out for: children who experience reading difficulty after 5 or 10 minutes. Because quite often it's all right to start with. It's only after a few minutes that the difficulties begin to manifest. Children who lose their place easily when they're reading, often skipping words or lines. They're blinking frequently, they rub their eyes, they look away from the page. They're not settled into the process of reading. They can't seem to look at the page for very long without looking uncomfortable. They move their head or their body restlessly. They can't seem to get a focal length. They track with their finger, because obviously if the lines are jumping around, they've got to try and hold them down. To think about all these symptoms, as often as not, children or adults who are experiencing this kind of discomfort don't realize that other people aren't having the same experience. They just think, "Oh, reading, no, I don't like reading, not for me." And they give up, screwing up their eyes at a page of text. Copying problems. Now this isn't just visual stress, this is also a processing difficulty that is often associated with dyslexia, because you're talking about processing in different planes. But quite often it can be exacerbated by visual stress as well. Obviously those who avoid reading altogether. Slow, halting readers. Yawning. Watch the ones who keep yawning. They might not just be tired. It may not be because they were up late at night. It may be because this is to do with reading. And I wonder what percentage of people now are catching that yawn, because I'm about to yawn. Different colour background. Now that colour there is much clearer for me than the... I got beige behind everything because I try not to do white backgrounds, but actually that is much nicer for me. I've got a little bit on other visual problems as well. Things like convergence insufficiency, which is the eyes not cause double vision basically. There's not a lot of in fact there isn't any peer-reviewed research out there that suggests that there is any strong correlation between convergence insufficiency and difficulty in reading. Well, one study found a weak correlate, but that was it. You'll find these figures actually out of that book I mentioned, Vision and Reading Difficulties. It's to do with the left eye and the right eye. They're focusing being off beam basically. Binocular instability. This is more common in the dyslexic population. Weak binocular coordination of reading saccades. That basically means that the eyes don't work very well together as they move from one character to the next. That's all that is. As opposed to not focusing on their characters, which is what convergence insufficiency was. So they don't cooperate very well, and so things can blur, move together. Now, some of the symptoms of visual stress can be caused by binocular instability, which is why it's always good, and I've mentioned this, say this somewhere, it's important that where there are persistent reading difficulties, bring in a vision professional if they persist. Obviously, if everything is sorted out and you can put an overlay down and suddenly reading speed is increased by 25 or 30%, you've probably nailed it. But it can be these things as well. And if someone's having difficulty reading, you've tried the overlays and everything else, binocular instability is fairly common in dyslexics. You can see those figures, 15% of dyslexics as opposed to 5% of the control. Behavioral optometrists in particular are well versed and effective in dealing with this kind of condition. And yes, here it is. Any child with persistent visual difficulties should be referred to an optometrist. This is quite interesting. You see, visual stress is often mixed up with dyslexia in particular, not so much dyspraxia. They are separate conditions. They need to be understood separately from each other, and they need to be assessed for separately from each other. It can be quite easy to mask the symptoms of visual stress in the general processing difficulties to do with text experienced by somebody with dyslexia. But they are not a result of dyslexia. They are a result of a condition of the visual cortex. They are just common in people with certain specific learning difficulties, especially dyslexia. So not every dyslexic experiences visual stress, but many visual stress sufferers are dyslexic. There's no peer-reviewed research that I know of that puts a figure to that, but there's anecdotal evidence around that puts it possibly around 35% of dyslexic people also have visual stress that's on the severe side. And also plenty of people without dyslexia have visual stress. I mean, we employ 15 people at Crossbar Education, and I can think of 6 come to mind who regularly use a coloured overlay, and one of those is dyslexic. No, 2, I beg your pardon. 4 aren't. So visual stress can, but yeah, mild visual stress they experience, not severe visual stress, but enough for them to find an overlay makes life a lot more comfortable for them when they're reading text on the screen or on paper. And here's a little Venn diagram. There's visual stress on its own at the bottom without association with any other difficulty. You can see that's, well, you can see for yourself 21, 5, the 8 people who've got dyslexia and dyspraxia also have visual stress. So the commonest comorbidity is between visual stress and dyslexia. They should be considered as co-occurring difficulties because that's what they are. They're co-occurring difficulties. There is no such thing as, well, I would say there is no such thing as visual dyslexia in that sense. I think it's a misnomer and I think it's misleading. And it confuses the symptoms of dyslexia with the cognitive processing of, it confuses the cortical symptoms of visual stress with the cognitive processing difficulties of dyslexia. They are distinct co-occurring difficulties. That's quite a small study from the University of Worcester, 45 positive assessments altogether. So you're 10 children in every 20 primary school, in every primary school of 200. You've seen that one already. But it's those children really that this presentation is thinking about. And the consequences of those children not being dealt with in the right way at the right time. Because as we all know, when children can't read, can't process text, then their whole progress through the education system can be brought to a complete halt, and their usefulness in society and their positive contribution to the community doesn't happen, simply because they failed to read at the beginning, got nothing out of school, and we'll look at that later. Perspective from a professional. You see, I mentioned earlier on, many people don't realize that they suffer from visual stress. They just muddle along. And then, for whatever reason, they're given an overlay assessment, and suddenly they see that reading through colour is what they've missed all their lives. And ask this question, how long have you had problems? They say, since I was at school. Years, can't remember, that sort of thing. And this is what I was referring to just now. The children who, throughout schooling, have had to struggle to complete or not to complete the reading and writing tasks that are the bread and butter, and still are the bread and butter of school life. It's like being in a game of football or netball or whatever team game you want to imagine, where everyone's running around and you've got to hobble about with crutches. And these students can't believe that the difference that an overlay makes. A simple coloured overlay, single colour, combination of colours. This comes from a dyslexia assessor who sent this letter to me a year or so ago. And I had a letter from a music student, a music tutor as well, who found that over 30% of her students improved their reading of music when they were reading through a coloured overlay, particularly in sight reading or performing situations where they were quite tense anyway. Yeah, over 30% benefited. And these weren't dyslexic people, this wasn't in school, this had nothing to do with the normal reading process. This was a music tutor with music students who suddenly found those little black things on those music pages, that music notation, suddenly kept still and were easy to discern through a coloured overlay. Wow, said one student. His reaction was disbelief. He said, wow. He started to smile. He could not believe he could see the print clearly after many years of struggling. See, this was orange. An orange overlay. The problem with John Stein's theories that it's got to be blue or yellow are evident when you see somebody who finds an orange colour makes a difference. Now, as I said, I've got some thoughts about that, which I'll come to shortly. I think they may both be right, actually. You'll see why. This is an extreme case. This was a particular case study done a couple of years ago. In fact, by the same assessor that assessed that little 6-year-old boy. He said, "Is that what you mean by a word?" This was a girl with undiagnosed visual stress at 14. She had a reading age of about 6. She'd made it through school, obviously a very supportive family, motivated child, but struggling as she went into beginnings, year 9, year 10 transition, reading age of a year 2, year 3 child. She used an overlay for a year, and after a year her reading age actually was slightly above her chronological age. And her predicted grades went from E, F to C and above because she was reading through colour. Now we talk about reading, writing. You see, if you think about it, if you're reading black and white and the words are jumping about, if you're writing black on white, the words will be jumping about. And the problem with that is, not only are the words jumping about as you write, therefore making it difficult for you to write accurately and clearly, but you're writing something, if it's in an exercise book, that you will want to read later. And so when you're reading it later, the words that were jumping about when you were writing them, and are therefore a mess, are jumping about again. So you get a double whammy if you've got visual stress, if you're writing on white paper. I remember a child I used to teach, I used to be a teacher, and he was year 10, and when he didn't often do any writing, and I didn't often teach him. He attended my lessons. That's about all one can say, I think, for a lot of the time. But when he did write, he would cover, and this was before I knew anything about this. This was way a long time ago. I qualified as a teacher in 1973, so I'll give you some idea. But he used to cover up his writing with his other hand as he wrote, so he didn't have to look at anything that he put on the page. And I often think about him, and in fact he didn't make it through school. He was permanently excluded, and he's probably became a statistic in the prison population as a result. But I often wonder if he had visual stress, if that had been sorted out, if he wrote on coloured paper, if he could read through an overlay, instead of writing some scribble that A, he couldn't read, and B, made him feel awful because his self-esteem would have sunk so low looking at what he did and comparing it with what other people did. If he could have written decent writing on decent, with decent words that he could read and understand and he could feel good about, you know, maybe his life would have been very different. So he's one that we left behind. So let's look at this little 7-year-old girl. This is up in Manchester somewhere. Now, she had already been diagnosed as a visual stress sufferer. She had yellow glasses. She wore her tinted lenses, and she was a good little girl. She wore her lenses. Now, this was done with her to get a comparison. What you can see now, excuse me while I drink, you'll hear a slurping sound probably, is her writing on white paper. My name is Barakam. I am 9 years old. I live in Blackburn. I something used to have a fish, etc. My fish was cold, doly, etc. You can read that my brother's fish. Well, you'll see what it says in a minute, because she put her glasses on and wrote the same words again. Look at that. Not just the neatness, but the spelling. Second line, years. She obviously knew how to spell it, whereas if you just looked at the attempt on the white paper, you would never know that she knew how to spell years. And so you would be trying to teach her that bowel digraph, you would be trying to teach her that cluster for no purpose at all, because actually she didn't know how to spell it, she simply couldn't see what she was writing. Blackburn, again, UR. She knew the UR, the R controlled vowel in Blackburn, but you wouldn't think so, and she knew the CK. She knew that digraph. You wouldn't think so looking at the writing on white paper. 2 spelling mistakes in Blackburn, both corrected when she's wearing her glasses. Well, you can't even see used to. She didn't quite get it right with the glasses on, but not far off. Used to. You can almost see, if you look at the way she wrote used to on the left-hand side, you can almost see how it was, the words were, the letters were running together on the page, because she sort of wrote one over another one, where she got them separated out with the glasses. I used to have a fish. My fish was called Dolly. She got the double L right. My brother, see the reversal there on the left? You can just about make it out. My brother, she didn't get the O of brother's fish. Never mind apostrophes. Oh, no, actually she's got the apostrophe. Do you know what? I've never seen that before. I don't know how many times I've put this slide up. She's got the apostrophe in my brother's fish. Was called Nemo. And kickboxing, again, she's got the ING. And she's got the CK. But my brother goes, well, she doesn't quite know how to spell karate, but my brother goes to karate. How much time would be spent doing remedial spelling work with that child? How much money would be spent on additional support for her when all she needed was to be tinting the paper? Now, as I said, she was wearing her glasses. Well, which are the best solution? Problem is, a lot of children don't like wearing glasses. But that slide, again, please remember that slide. So much time can be wasted doing the wrong thing, and doing the expensive thing, and doing the time-consuming thing, and doing the frustrating thing, when actually what the child needs is to read through colour and write on it. Thanks to North East Lancashire Dyslexia Association for providing those samples. And those are the spelling mistakes that she corrected. Black bun, used to, cold, dolly, brother, Nemo without a capital N, kickboxing without the ING. I think she put the K in as well, if we remember. So, wrong remediation unless you use colour. I think I made the point. And there's the yellow. That's what she saw. And that's why it worked. Now, lenses, what do you use for your intervention? Lenses are ideal. They are the best. They are the best. We don't do lenses. If you can get a child to wear coloured lenses, then you are giving them the optimum solution. And we recommend the colorimetry process, which gives a possibility of choosing between about 30,000 different tints to optimize the exact choice of color. There are others on the market. Erlen have a different system. There are Chromogen. There are various types of lenses. That's the one that we recommend. The colorimeter was invented by Arnold Wilkins from Essex, who's our guru, I suppose. We consult with him on all our color decisions and so on. Lenses are ideal, but you know, it's not always the look that many 12-year-olds will go for. 7-year-olds, yeah, but the older they get, they're more self-conscious, as we know a child becomes as they get into puberty and teens. And the lenses get lost, left behind, broken, mysteriously disappear. And they're expensive, and a lot of families actually just can't afford them. And obviously schools can't afford them. So they are the best possible solution in an ideal world. It's not a world that a lot of children live in. which leaves us with overlays or reading rulers. So the reading rulers there, we invented the reading with the I-double reading ruler. There are other strips of reading aid around as well, but the one with the edge with the two tinted edges and the blacked out or the opaque middle is our own design, and we think they're preferable to the ones with a letterbox in the middle because they're the only ones that you can actually track down the page with. If you have one with a letterbox in the middle, as soon as you move the reading ruler, a child who's got tracking difficulties is going to lose their place. Some research was done last year at Birkbeck College at the University of London, and they were specifically comparing reading speeds in children, a group of children using reading rulers and coloured overlays, whole page overlays. They tested 78 children, various reading levels from 1 to 7. And of those 78, 39 had overlays and 39 had reading rulers. The results were pretty amazing, actually. All but 4 experienced improvements in reported clarity of text and in reading speed. And the 4 were the oldest ones with the highest reading levels to begin with. So 74 children out of 78 found it easier to read through colour. Near visual acuity, in other words, how clear things are close up, 34.61% could see things more clearly. Look at that. With the overlays, whole page overlays, maximum improvement between 23 and 38%. Okay, that's increase in reading speed, in case that statistic's not very clear. Up to 38% faster reading. Reading rule is a bit slower. Not a lot slower. Certainly the bottom end, certainly nearly 20% as opposed to 23 at the bottom end. Top end, 31.5 as opposed to 38. I think that may be because if you're using a reading ruler, you're tracking down the page, so there's another processing activity going on, which is probably going to slow processing down a little bit. But there's some interesting results came out of that as well. So both very high, 38 or 31% increasing reading speed when reading through colour. They continued the research to find out which children preferred which reading aid. And what they found was this. First of all, it was children reading at low levels, so the greatest improvement. 74% chose overlays to take away the reading rulers, so the greatest improvement was found using the whole page overlays as opposed to the reading rulers, and when asked which one they wanted to keep initially, 74% of the children tested chose the coloured overlays, which is in keeping with the fact that you've got the higher maximum reading speed. But 13 of the 20 who chose the reading rulers show the strongest overt signs of reading difficulty and visual stress. In other words, that's 13 out of the entire population who were tested. In other words, the children with the most severe visual stress and the greatest tracking difficulties prefer the reading rulers to the overlays. So it seems that although the overlays took reading to a higher reading speed overall, for the children who had the most difficulty, they actually found the reading ruler more useful because of the additional tracking support that it gave them. Start them young. Largest improvement in 5 to 6 year olds. Like the little boy who said, "Can I start reading now?" He was 6. But after 3 months, reading rulers seem to be preferred over overlays. Children like them because they're little, they're unobtrusive, and they give them that additional tracking support. Yeah, 2012 that was originally done. You can read. We have a website, another website called visualstressassess.com. The full report is on there if you want to read that. Visualstressassess.com, and you'll find their report. Now, these figures, I'm going to come back to John Stein and Arnold Wilkins in a minute, and the idea of, is it blue and yellow? Stein, Oxford say it is. Do you need all 10 colours? Wilkins and his collaborators at Essex would say that. These figures were compiled over 3 years. Now, we sell a lot of reading rulers and overlays. Just how many? Okay, 30,000 over 1 year. Reading rulers sold in selections of individual colour packs. Okay, so these are figures from 1 year, and you can see that the preferred colour was definitely yellow. Then aqua and sky. Aqua is on the blue side. It's a greeny blue rather than the bluey green. So it's on the blue side of the blue and green mix, and sky is blue. Essentially, sky is the sort of blue that you've got in the panel. If you've got the control panel on the right hand side of your screen, it's that sort of colour. Yeah, sky blue. So look at those figures. The blues and the yellows are the strongest. And now those figures are not just 1 year's figures. They're actually been replicated consistently over 3 years. So as a longitudinal study, that data has got some significance. That is repeated and repeated and repeated again with pretty well the same sort of proportions, just increasing in number as the amount of reading rulers overall is sold, but the percentages and the proportions remain the same. The highest one is yellow, the lowest one is magenta, pinky colour. Now, what I think is this. It could be that John Stein and Arnold Wilkins are both right. This is only Bob's thoughts, okay? I've got no proof of this. It's just my observation. Because if there is such a thing as magnocellular deficit causing visual stress symptoms as a result, if there are visual stress symptoms being caused by magnocellular deficit, causing the parva cells to be overworked and this fast lane and slow lane thing I showed you, that could be behind some instances of visual stress. And cortical hyperexcitability, as Wilkins and his colleagues have got a lot of evidence to underpin this theory, but it still must be seen as a theory. But if that theory holds true, that could be behind other instances of visual stress. And if that is the case, that would explain why the blues and the yellows are more popular than the other colours. And if you took the blues, if you took the sum of the blues and the yellows out, in other words, if you took some of the magnocellular deficit visual stress sufferers off that page, you would then end up with quite similar numbers for the rest. Particularly if people who were buying aqua could also have responded well to a sky blue. So there you could have a breakdown of the magnocellular deficit people and the cortical hyperexcitability people. It's only a theory, it's only an idea, and at the end of the day, what is important is not so much why it happens, although that is interesting. What is important is what we can do about it. Well, what we can do about it is ensure that people with visual stress are assessed and that they're given the support that they need. You might find this interesting. Let's let that run. I've got a few different backgrounds there. I've got a white and some different colours. You might find that one of them makes a particularly significant difference to you. That grey, incidentally, I don't know what's happened. That's supposed to be a blue. I'll just go back there. Just a point on grey, actually. Grey overlays, there are some grey overlays on the market. We don't sell them. I think it's one of the other companies that does overlays. I think it's Cerium do a grey. Wilkins has done quite extensive research into the different colours, and his findings are that grey in itself does not increase reading speed. Where there is a difference with grey, he seems to feel that it is a placebo effect. the colour that's missing on there is blue. I must change that slide because the bottom one is not what I want it to be. So the cost. Aaron mentioned a little deal the Dyslexia shop have got on, so yeah, if you want to buy reading rulers or overlays, then take advantage of their 10% off. Now these are the retail price, or the approximate retail prices. Incidentally, these are ex-VAT. So if you go on the BDA shop site and say, hey, that's more than 50 quid, I wanted an assessment pack, but it's 60, whatever it is, that's because there's VAT, unfortunately. Okay, so these are ex-VAT. If you're a school, of course, you get the VAT back, but you would need to add the VAT to these prices. The assessment pack, now the visual stress assessment pack is written by the person who wrote that is also dyslexic. It's written very much for non-specialists. If you're not a specialist, you want some easy to follow information, a good background of visual stress and what it actually is. You want an assessment protocol that you can follow without any difficulty, that you don't need a degree in visual science to understand. In other words, if you are a non-specialist teacher or teaching assistant working in a school or in a workplace or in a prison or wherever your professional or other status is, and you want something to use to see if people A, have got visual stress, and B, if they have what colour they need, that is, well, obviously we produce it, so we think it's the best, but it's very much written to be A, thorough, and B, easy to use for non-specialists. And that is also, Arnold Wilkins himself has gone through that with a tooth comb for us. In fact, when we sent him the manuscript and we went down to see him to have a meeting about it, he actually offered to give us a mark, which I thought was very nice of him, but we declined on the offer. But yes, that's now used by a lot of people, simple to use, and will tell you, gives you a protocol, gives you photocopyable forms, gives you templates for letters to send home to your to parents of children and so on if you need them, and it's all for 50 quid. That includes the overlays as well, and the rate of reading test, or a test that is the same as the rate of reading test that we developed again with Arnold Wilkins's approval. So that's one resource you can use, and then there's this is the cost of supporting a student, by the way. If £30 doesn't pay for books, that's not the cost of a book or anything. This is about what it would cost to provide reading rulers and overlays and tinted exercise books for one primary school child over about it. It'd probably cost the school about 30 quid to support that child. In other words, the little boy who's 6 said, can I start learning to read now? And obviously write as well on tinted paper with tinted exercise books. It will cost the school about £30 a year to facilitate those activities for that child. So if you've got 10 children like that in school who need that support, it is going to cost the school a grand total of about £300 and 50 quid for an assessment pack. And those are the individual prices: 10 overlays, 25 quid, 10 reading rulers, about £10. In fact, about £9 really. These are my conference prices. So I have this presentation at conferences. So if people buy them off me at the conference stand, that's what they would pay, including VAT. So they're actually £8.99 plus VAT, the retail price of the web shop. Okay, 10 tinted exercise books, about £13, and then you've got that summary at the bottom of what it would cost for one child to have what they need of those resources. So it's not a lot to provide that support. Not a lot at all. Right, now the other question is, if that's the cost of support, which is less than one pupil premium, incidentally, and if you think of some of the things that pupil premiums are spent on, yeah, you might wonder what the return is. But there, your return is going to be a child reading and writing throughout his school career and achieving his potential. The cost of no support. Well, I did some work on looking at the prison population, looking at the effect of dyslexia and visual stress potentially in prison. People, in other words, who have failed in the education system. UK prison, 86,000 odd. That was November 2012. Now then, follow this. 50% of those prisoners, reading age of about 11 or much less. There's a strong connection, I think everyone knows this, there's been a lot of research done, between illiteracy and offending. And those of you who are on the yacht course, you know all about this, because you are getting the results of those 6-year-olds who never did discover what it was to learn to read in some cases. So you'll be familiar with these statistics. About 25% are dyslexic. So I reckoned that if 5% of the national statistic are severely suffer from visual stress, then it would be fairly conservative to suggest that maybe 10% of the prison population. Now I'd love to do some research on this, and we've got a psychology graduate who's joined us quite recently in the company. I'm going to send her out to do this in the next couple of years. I want to do some research on visual stress in prisons. If anybody out there who's listening to this would like to collaborate with that, I'd love to hear from you. And I'm reckoning it will be conservative to say about 10% have got severe visual stress, because if 25% of the prison population is dyslexic, that is more than double the national average, which is considered to be about 10%. Okay. It costs about £45,000 a year. Figures vary a bit. Others say 37. That's the national the Ministry of Justice figures say 37,000. Guess which one's the lowest? There's another one that comes about in the middle of it, around 40,000. This was a Guardian survey in 2010. And there's that one said 45,000. Okay, 45,000. Going to do some maths now. 45,000 times whatever I said. 45,000 lots of 8,600 gives us £387 million, which we are spending as a nation keeping people in prison who may just, I'm not saying they are, and I know these figures are, I'm getting a bit kind of missional in a sense now. I get a bit wound up when I think about this. I think about that boy who covered his handwriting with his hand and wouldn't produce anything and then was chucked out. Yeah, £387 million. We're spending, if not that much, certainly a significant figure approaching that, of people who are probably only behind bars because they never learnt to read and write at school and then went into crime instead because they weren't given colour when they were 6. The average annual cost of assessing and supporting visual stress in 20,000 primary schools is going to be a lot less, isn't it? What could we spend £380 million on? How many schools could we build with the money that we save? How many teachers, children could we educate with the money that we would save by just assessing weak readers in school for visual stress by the end of Key Stage 1? That really is where it all goes. Hundreds of millions of pounds thrown away, thousands of lost lives. We have to assess every weak reader for visual stress. Thank you very much for listening. I've probably gone on a little bit longer than I